Hello, welcome to Parcon 2021. Thank you for joining this first session where we'll be exploring what Parkinson's is and what causes it. I'm Laurel Miller, your host for this session. I was diagnosed with Parkinson's 7 years ago. Today, I'm pleased to be joined by Professor Steve Gentleman, Director of Parkinson's UK Brain Bank, and Dr. Alastair Noyce, a consultant neurologist. I'm really looking forward to talking to both of them. Many of the topics discussed will also be explored in later sessions throughout Parcon. After the main session, our speakers will be live to answer your questions. You can raise a question using the Ask a Question button. All the conference content will be available to watch on demand for 30 days after the event, so don't worry if you miss anything. So let's begin. Steve, what is Parkinson's and how does it compare to other degenerative neurological conditions?
Okay, hi, good morning. Yes, Parkinson's disease is what we describe as a progressive neurodegenerative disorder. So deconstructing that, neurodegenerative, that's loss of nerve cells in the brain. And progressive obviously means as it spreads through the brain, things get worse. So it's, I think, the second most common neurodegenerative disease. Everyone's heard of Alzheimer's disease. That's the most common neurodegenerative disease. But obviously everyone associates that with memory problems, whereas Parkinson's disease generally is a movement problem. And I think we're talking in the UK now about 150,000 people living with Parkinson's in the UK at the moment. So what is it? It's loss of those nerve cells. Loss of those nerve cells mean you can't move properly. And we can go into a little bit more detail about the specifics of that. But ultimately, it's loss of those cells. And unfortunately, at the moment, we can't cure Parkinson's disease, but we have lots of ways of helping manage the symptoms. So the bottom line is we can treat, we can help people living with Parkinson's to make the best of things. But ultimately, what we need research-wise is something that stops the process going on in the brain. So ultimately, that's why we're all here. We're all trying to work out how we can stop this progression.
Thanks, Steve. So I'm experiencing problems, Alastair, and my GP refers me to you. How easy is it to diagnose Parkinson's, and how would you break the news to someone?
So thanks, Laurel. Good morning. So you've described the normal pathway that people tend to first present to their general practitioners in primary care with symptoms, and then that, one hopes, prompts a diagnosis to secondary care and to specialists, either neurologists or care of the elderly or geriatrician type doctors that are experienced in making the diagnosis of Parkinson's disease. I think the first thing to say is that people go and see their general practitioners for a variety of reasons in the years before they actually get referred for a diagnosis. And we know from research that this can go back 5, 10, 15 years even. But it's usually when either the person seeing their GP or the GP spots that there's a movement problem that prompts the diagnosis to see a specialist. And that movement problem may be slowing down, stiffness, or tremor, or something like that. So then our national guidelines say that we should see people in secondary care. And when I see people, I take a careful history of what's been happening over the recent years. I take a family history as well. I review the medical notes and I do a careful clinical examination, because the thing about Parkinson's disease is the diagnosis is what we call a clinical diagnosis. It means that we make the diagnosis based on the story that we are told and what the clinical examination shows us. And although there are some tests that help support the diagnosis, it's really based on the story and the clinical examination that we make that diagnosis. And we probably get it right about, I would say, 15% of the time. You know, when research is done, such as in the setting that Professor Gentleman oversees, we know that we were wrong proportion of the time. So it's also not just important to see a specialist for the diagnosis, but to be followed up by a specialist, because I do warn people that we need to keep things under review. It's possible the diagnosis may change over time.
Thanks, Alastair. So say in the circumstances, Steve, where I've been told I've got Parkinson's and it's idiopathic, what does that actually mean?
So idiopathic is a little bit of a cop-out. Idiopathic, I think in Greek, is one's own disease. And essentially it means we don't know what's caused it. So idiopathic is by far the most common form of Parkinson's disease. We know some of the things going on, but we don't really know the bottom line, what caused it. Whereas there are other types of Parkinson's disease. I without wanting to encroach on Dr. Noyce's area, Parkinsonism is a set of symptoms which he sees in the clinic. And there are a number of different causes of Parkinsonism, that set of symptoms. By far the most common is Parkinson's disease. And that's what he described 200 years ago from observing people while sitting in a park bench. So that was given his name, that set of symptoms. But actually there are other things that can cause similar symptoms. So there are other things that can look like Parkinson's disease. And that's what Dr. Noyce was talking about in terms of a little bit of doubt sometimes in the clinic. But the other types are vascular Parkinson's. You may have heard of that term. And that's where the problems in the brain are down to insufficient blood supply. So something's happened in that area of the brain that we know is important for movement, and it looks symptomatically a bit like Parkinson's disease. Historically, there are some drug-induced types of Parkinson's disease. I think a lot of people have heard about the west coast of the US drugs that were developed under the counter, so to speak. And people that took these, younger people, developed a Parkinson's type presentation. And that was down to damaging the same area of the brain that is damaged in Parkinson's disease. And then there are a couple of other clinical diagnoses that can look like Parkinson's disease. And I will just mention two. One is multiple system atrophy, or MSA. And the other one is progressive supranuclear palsy, PSP. Fairly obvious reasons why we abbreviate them. But they both can look to the clinicians like Parkinson's disease. But usually they'll be able to pick those out in the clinic. And as was said earlier, at the brain bank, when people come to post-mortem and we check, maybe 10% of cases, there's perhaps slightly different pathology to what we were expecting to find.
Thanks, Steve. So it's much more complicated than it may seem. So, Alastair, we're assuming I've got Parkinson's. We're not sure, well, there's various types. It's probably idiopathic. But what are the early symptoms that mean it may be Parkinson's?
Thank you, Laurel. And just to pick up on the comments that Professor Gentleman made, I think idiopathic is a bit of a cop-out, and we'll make progress in understanding the different subtypes of Parkinson's disease. But in one way that does ring true as well, because it really is one's own disease. Parkinson's affects people very differently. And there's another saying that goes, if you've seen one person with Parkinson's, you've seen one person with Parkinson's. So we recognize that there are a whole constellation of symptoms that can occur in Parkinson's. Yes, predominantly the focus has been on movement problems, and those are often prominent in Parkinson's disease. And those movement problems may be tremor, particularly occurring at rest when you're not doing anything, rigidity in the arms or legs. It may be that rigidity is not noticed, and instead people experience pain in those limbs. Generally slowing down or feeling off balance when walking. Early falls is a little bit different. If people have early falls, it makes us think about some of those other types of Parkinsonism that Professor Gentleman mentioned. and changes in facial expression, changes in handwriting and fine movement. So that's really an overview of the motor symptoms. But we increasingly recognise that non-motor symptoms are important and affect patients as much as motor symptoms. Changes in sense of smell, which people may or may not notice, but when tested objectively are very common. Sleep disorders are very common in Parkinson's disease, whether it's insomnia, early waking, a certain type of sleep disorder called REM sleep behavior disorder, changes in mood like anxiety and depression, constipation, changes in blood pressure or erectile dysfunction, and then changes in speech and saliva, and also cognitive symptoms, memory problems and processing problems. So there's a whole range of symptoms that we recognize in Parkinson's. Any of these can really occur at any time. A lot of them can occur quite early on and even prior to diagnosis. I mentioned that people see their GPs for things going back for years. But generally, and picking up again on a comment that was made earlier, the nature of things is that they accumulate over time. And so after 5 years or 10 years of Parkinson's, you would expect to see more of those symptoms in those individuals.
Thanks, Alastair. So I've been diagnosed, but I think you just said that I could have been coming on over many years. How would being diagnosed earlier help, both now perhaps, and as we make progress in the future?
Yes, I think this is a great question. I think there are really two ways to answer it. So the first is that at the point typically that a diagnosis is made, there's already been quite a lot of damage and dysfunction taking place in the important cells in the brain. And so it's said in general that when people get a diagnosis, they probably lost half of the brain cells in those central brain structures. And this may be a key reason why at the moment we don't have cures for Parkinson's, albeit that we have good drugs to manage the symptoms of Parkinson's. And so the notion is that if you could identify people at an earlier age, and this has been a big research focus of mine, if you could identify people at an earlier age when there's been less cell loss, less dysfunction, then you could intervene and try to change the trajectory and try to slow things down or modify the disease. So on one level, earlier diagnosis may mean a better chance of a cure. But there's another way to answer the question, which is around when is it timely to make a diagnosis? So we don't want to thrust an early diagnosis of Parkinson's disease onto patients that don't really have symptoms or are not bothered by it. But what we know, and what we've already discussed, is that people come and see their doctor for years and years and years before they actually get a diagnosis. And actually, if we could pick up those people when they have symptoms but don't yet have a diagnosis, then potentially we could intervene and make things better for them. And so that's less about being just early diagnosed and more about being timely for the individual that's affected.
Thanks, Alastair. So dopamine cells are dying. Steve, what actually happens inside my brain during Parkinson's?
Okay, perhaps if I could just share a couple of pictures with you, I can explain what goes on. Let me just see if I can share here. Okay, so I'm not going to go into great detail here, but what you were hearing about from Alastair there was that there are certain cells in the brain which contain dopamine. Dopamine is what we call a neurotransmitter, and it allows nerve cells to communicate with each other. The cells here in this part of the brain called the brainstem down here, in an area called the substantia nigra, the black substance. So over here, I've got a section through that area of the brain, and you can see this black line. That's a pigment there in those dopaminergic cells. So during life, you build up a little bit of pigment in those cells. So in your 50s and 60s, you have quite a dark substantia nigra. People who have Parkinson's, these cells have died off. And these cells, therefore, they've been removed, and we've lost the color here. So at an autopsy, the first indication that this person might have had Parkinson's for me is when I make this cut and see there's loss of that black line. So that's the loss of those dopaminergic cells. What do? Well, they project to the heart of the brain, right at the core of the brain, to an area which is very important in planning and initiating movement. So as we've already heard, you may have a tremor, which is an uncontrolled movement, and that's down to this loss of normal connections. Or you may actually have trouble starting to move things. And again, that's because this area at the core of the brain has lost its innervation. And if we go down to the microscopic level, this is a nerve cell in the substantia nigra. So all the black stuff here is the pigment. This is a big nucleus, it's a nice big cell. But in this cell, we can see the main pathology of Parkinson's disease, which is the Lewy bodies. And that's basically, in this case, a blue blob, here a pink blob. They're all the same thing. These are called Lewy bodies. And because they're forming in those nerve cells are damaged and cease to function and eventually will die. So until about 20 years ago, this is all we knew about the pathology. But now, with the moving on in understanding genetics and protein chemistry, we now know there's a protein called alpha-synuclein, which is what forms those Lewy bodies. So up here, you've got a Lewy body. But what that also showed us was that the pathology is much wider spread in the brain than just in those dopaminergic cells in the brainstem. And the spread of alpha-synuclein changes like these through the brain is what we feel underlies the development of different symptoms over time, depending on where this pathology has spread.
So, Steve, why might brain cells stop working?
The million-dollar question, really. So these cells have long projections, so they have to project a long way. So they need a lot of energy. Nerve cells are constantly firing. They're always in use, so they need a lot of energy. And there's a little component of the cell called a mitochondrion, which is a little powerhouse, if you like, in each cell. And certainly from the genetics that we could perhaps talk about a little bit later, it's genetics of mitochondrial function. The function of those little powerhouses may be impaired in Parkinson's disease. And there are all sorts of other processes that may be not working quite right in those cells. So you saw a lump of alpha-synuclein in those cells I just showed you. The normal way of things, that would be broken down and would be part of the normal processing. For whatever reason, that normal clearance pathway is not working anymore. So that cell becomes compromised. It doesn't work properly anymore and ultimately will die. So there are maybe 4 or 5 normal processing pathways going on in these nerve cells, all of which may be compromised one way or the other by different mechanisms. And really it's a focus of a lot of the molecular and cellular research nowadays to try and pinpoint exactly which pathways and how we could stop that happening.
So clearly there are complicated things going on in my brain. But Alastair, where does Parkinson's actually start?
Thank you, Laurel. Well, I don't think we know the answer to that either. One of the difficult things is because people with Parkinson's are also different and their symptoms are different, we get some clues perhaps from the story about where their disease may have started, but we only get one opportunity at the end of it all, okay, when people die, to look under a microscope and see where there was involvement more generally. So there are some people that think that Parkinson's disease begins in the brain and then spreads around the brain. There are people that believe that it comes in from the outside, so through potentially through the nose and what we call the olfactory apparatus. And there are people that believe Parkinson's starts in the gut. Okay, and both smell loss and constipation are symptoms that go back many years before a diagnosis. So it's plausible that those are entry points. And the nose, the back of the nose, is well connected to the brain, and the gut is also very well connected to the brain via the vagus nerve. So we don't know for sure, but there are lots of hypotheses about where Parkinson's might start.
Okay, thanks. So you both told us a lot about what it is, but what actually do you think at this stage might cause it? And could it be prevented? Could I have done something different in my life, which would mean I wasn't sitting here now with Parkinson's talking to you guys?
I think on a case-by-case basis, that's very difficult to pinpoint. What we know over the years is that there is an important genetic contribution to Parkinson's disease, and that's complicated. It's not as simple as saying that if you have a mother or father with Parkinson's disease or a sibling with Parkinson's disease, then you are also going to get Parkinson's disease. And it is relatively uncommon for a single gene to be the cause of Parkinson's disease in any given person or any given family. But like other complex diseases, what we've seen is that there is a contribution of genetics more generally, small multiple effects spread out across the genome, which may contribute to your susceptibility or risk of getting Parkinson's. So genetics is a key aspect of this. The second aspect of this is environmental risk factors. So it's been shown in many large studies that exposure to pesticides puts people at a slightly higher risk of Parkinson's disease than people that are not exposed to pesticides. Now, pinpointing exactly which pesticides, some are more implicated than others, and pinpointing where in your life course and how much exposure one has is very difficult to do. There is also links to head injuries, particularly repetitive head trauma, and exposure to heavy metals in kind of population-based studies or in occupational studies where people do have exposure to metals. There's less evidence for pollution, but research in pollution is in the fairly early stages and only really just taking off. And one of my interests is how other comorbidities like obesity or type 2 diabetes might predispose people to Parkinson's or other neurological diseases. And perhaps more than that, how if you have type 2 diabetes and Parkinson's, how type 2 diabetes may leave you susceptible to a more aggressive form of Parkinson's unless that's well controlled. So it's complicated. It's a combination of genetics and the environment, and we still have lots of work to do in this area.
Right, so no easy answer to that question, I'm afraid. I'm a bit clearer on my next one, which I'd like to direct to Steve. Can diet, can socialization, can exercise, can a combination of all three help to slow the progression of Parkinson's once it's been diagnosed?
Another tricky question. Picking up from what Alastair was saying, everyone is different in their susceptibility based on their genetic makeup, subtle differences there, mixed of environmental factors. What I would say is for healthy old age, if you like, you can perhaps, your best approach is to perhaps modify midlife lifestyle factors. So brain function is entirely dependent on a good blood supply. So the brain's only about 1.5 kilos, but it takes 20% of your cardiac output. So the heart is very busy supplying the brain. Any interruption to that can cause brain problems. So it brings it back to, don't forget about the brain, forget about your general health and your body in terms of your vascular system. So the three, again, at autopsy, when I look at the blood vessels at the base of the brain, I get a little bit of a clue about lifestyle, because if there's damage to the vessels, there are the three things we always think about as risk factors for vascular disease are high-fat diet, So we see a build-up of fat on the inside of the vessels, which is largely related to diet. Some people, unfortunately, that's a genetic susceptibility, but for most of us, it's purely diet. Smoking is not good for your blood vessels. And the other one is lack of exercise. So from what you suggested just then, I think, yes, exercise is always good because it keeps the heart going and therefore is keeping a good blood supply to the brain. And just other things that are involved in general vascular health. And I think it's a bit of a cliche, but there is the whole use it or lose it type of approach as well. And I don't think that does any harm. I think interacting with other people is keeping your brain active. And I certainly think, yes, trying to maintain social contact is a good way of keeping things going.
Mm. And can I, does the fact that I've got Parkinson's mean I can pass it on to my children?
Genetic inherited forms of Parkinson's are very rare. And in clinical practice, I would defer back to Alastair, but I think because it's quite a common problem, just because you've got Parkinson's in 2 generations, that's quite usually just by chance. I think if you've got 3 successive generations, you then might start to think about, well, is there a family connection here? And is there a genetic test you could do to see if this is being inherited? But those cases are really very rare. I think less than 5% of Parkinson's is easily traceable as a genetic form of Parkinson's. And as Alastair said before, we're all slightly different in our genetic makeup, and that all makes us slightly more susceptible one way or the other. But pure inheritance, a single gene inheritance, as we would call it, is very rare.
Right, thanks, Steve. That's a relief. Alastair, another question for you. I heard you say in a lecture in 2019 that the outlook for people with Parkinson's is not bleak because they can take part in research trials. Do you talk to patients about this? And if so, when would you raise it with them?
Thanks, Laurel. I mean, I think the outlook is not bleak for more reasons than just that. So actually, when I'm talking to people about their diagnosis around the time that you break the diagnosis or when you're seeing them in follow-up, I think that there are lots of ways that people can be proactive and take ownership of the diagnosis. And they're better examples than just taking part in research. As Steve has said, a commitment to exercise, a commitment to social engagement, mental stimulation, and as I say, taking ownership of the diagnosis. So care around your medication and thoughtfulness around medication, reflection on one's symptoms so that you make the most of consultations with your doctor. When you talk about research, then I think it's vitally important that patients take part in research. And as you've heard both Steve and I say today, we have probably more questions than answers right now. And the only way that we'll solve those questions and make progress is through research. So I talk about getting involved in research very early on with my patients, usually in the first consultation. One has to be a little sensitive depending on how the consultation's going. But I explain to people that our clinic is a research active clinic and they will be asked and invited if they want to take part in research, and we have a clinical coordinator who can discuss some of the projects. I do also, in terms of the benefits to patients taking part in research, there's this kind of sense of well-being and positive mental attitude that contributing to something has. There's also the possibility, if you're in an intervention study, that the intervention works or you derive benefit regardless of which arm of the trial you're on. And usually it means that you end up seeing your clinician or part of member of the clinical team more regularly. But I'm also careful to say to people that they shouldn't take part just because they think their doctor wants them to take part. The participation in research should be voluntary, it should be free from coercion, and it shouldn't change your clinical care at all.
Thank you, Alastair. Anybody, whether diagnosed with Parkinson's or not, can take part in research, and opportunities are listed on the Take Part Hub on the Parkinson's UK website. That link will be shared with you and will be discussed in other Parcon sessions. So to go back to Steve, you manage the Parkinson's UK Brain Bank, Steve. Can you explain how this works and how it has benefited research into Parkinson's so far?
Yes, yes, I have the honour of directing the Brain Bank. As you probably worked out, I'm a neuropathologist. I do the diagnostics, and so the Brain Bank is funded by the charity Parkinson's UK to collect post-mortem brain tissue for research. So the charity, we have the infrastructure here at Hammersmith Hospital. We have people who are interested. They may come and visit us to see what we do, or they are just wanting to make a contribution to the research. And they sign up while alive to donate their brain for research when the time comes. And it's our job from anywhere in the country, when someone passes on, the next of kin or the clinicians looking after them will let us know. We will arrange a retrieval, get the brain back here, hopefully in under 48 hours. That's what we're aiming for. The structures of the NHS, that's a bit of a challenge sometimes, but we do. And we will then process that. I will dissect the brain. Half of it will be frozen, half of it will be fixed. And then 5-6 weeks later, I'll come back. I'll look at that fixed brain, the bit that's gone into formalin, stops it falling apart. It preserves it. I dissect that brain, and I then have a look and see everything that was going on in that individual's brain. If you like, the brain is a record of your life, because everything that went on in your life, to some extent, was encoded in the brain. But what I do is I look for all the pathologies, all the changes. So, someone at the age of 65 has had a lifetime of experience. They'll have had a few knocks. They may be developing a little bit of Alzheimer type change that didn't produce any symptoms. But I need to do this very thorough workup, because I need to send that detail out with the brain tissue that goes out to labs all over the world. So the charity are not that worried about how many brains we collect. It's how many brains we get out to labs throughout the world to maximize our chances of finally sorting out how we're going to stop this. So as I say, I find it a huge privilege talking to people who bequest their brains to research, talking to them, and then talking to the families afterwards. And one of the parts of the job which I enjoy is talking to the families and to some extent giving them some closure on what we found and how this is going to help, we hope, things going forward.
Thanks, Steve. I find that very comforting. Thank you. And finally, Alastair, has there been any suggestion that COVID increases the risk of Parkinson's?
Yes, I get asked this question a fair bit in the last 18 months. So I think the short answer is that we just don't know yet. So there have been outbreaks of Parkinsonism historically linked to pandemics, infectious pandemics, but never that convincingly linked. And we are still, although we're 18 months in, slightly longer, we're still very much in the phase of finding out what COVID does to people in the long run. So we don't know yet whether COVID increases the risk of Parkinson's disease, and we probably won't know for several years. But it's an important area of surveillance, and we will find out with time. Hopefully not.
Great. Thanks, Alastair. And thank you both for taking part in this discussion about Parkinson's and its possible causes. I look forward to seeing both Steve and Alastair again for the live question and answer session. Thank you.
Thank you, Laurel.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Day 1, Session 1 of ParCon. We're so pleased to have so many of you here with us live today. I'm Liz Nash, the Research Support Network Manager at Parkinson's UK, and I'm very pleased to be joined by Laurel Miller, who helped plan today's event, Steve Gentleman, and Alastair Noyce, our expert Q&A panel. And yes, we're going to take as many questions as we have time for, so please do pop your questions into the Q&A box. And I'm going to introduce Laurel now with our first question.
Hello. This question is for Alastair. Alastair, you said in your talk that your clinic is research active. Why aren't all clinics like that?
Well, thanks, Laurel. I don't know. It's a good question. I mean, I think that so you need to have a clinician, I guess, in the clinic, not necessarily at the helm of a movement disorder service, but within the clinic, who is interested in taking part in research, either leading research or participating in wider research projects. There are limited, in some parts of the country, there are limited access to movement disorder services, and one thing you need to do research is time and resources, so there's a limitation. I personally think that all patients attending clinics should be given the opportunity to take part in research, but sometimes it's difficult in NHS settings. All I can say is watch this space, because we're trying to put some plans together to make sure that patients, wherever they're seen in the country, can participate in research. We're hoping to bring news about that in the next few months.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. And I have some questions here from our audience, which I'll read out. So firstly, a question from Andy. Parkinson's is being referred to as a single disease. Is that still the assumption from the scientific community who are looking for new therapies and indeed a cure? Alastair, any thoughts on that?
Thanks for the question. So you probably heard us say in the session that Parkinson's is an incredibly varied and heterogeneous condition, and no two people with Parkinson's look the same. So I think if you see a lot of patients in clinic, you recognise that there is this very broad spectrum of what we call Parkinson's disease, with different motor features, different non-motor features, and it's hard to believe that that is one single disease entity. So I think we use Parkinson's disease as an umbrella term for a variety of different disorders with different changes going on in the brain and the wider neurological system. And I think what's good is that this is a kind of active area of research, and one that we're going to make progress in over the next few years.
Thank you. Steve, anything to add on that, or else our next question is for you?
Well, I'll just add a little bit from the pathology perspective. I agree entirely. Every individual has their own journey with Parkinson's disease. The other thing I would say in terms of the research science is that a number of the people who donate and come to the brain bank don't have Parkinson's disease. They had something that looked like Parkinson's disease with a different cause. So yes, there are varieties of Parkinsonism. So the symptoms, by far the most common cause of Parkinsonism is Parkinson's disease, but there are others. So just the ones that you may have heard of are multiple system atrophy and progressive supranuclear palsy. And the issue there is, if you're designing a drug to attack the protein problem at the basis of Parkinson's disease, for example, PSP is a different protein. So we do have to be careful. If we, hopefully, when we get there, we have a clinical trial for a drug that will stop the Parkinson's process. We need to make sure it's the right drug for the right patient, because they won't work on those who haven't got Parkinson's disease. I hope that makes sense.
Thanks very much, Steve. And this next question is also for you. Can you talk us through the process of brain donation to the brain bank?
Okay, yes. So I'm sure most of you are aware that Parkinson's UK funds the brain bank here at Imperial. And we are here to facilitate people's last wish, people who sign up while they're alive, who would like to leave their brain for Parkinson's research. And so if you are interested in that and want to find out a bit more about that, I would suggest going to the Parkinson's UK website, where there's a link to the Brain Bank here at Imperial. There's plenty of information there, and you can contact us anytime with questions about exactly what the process is about. I could go into a lot more details about the practicalities, but I think that should be the first port of call if you are interested. Yes, I would suggest having a look at the site first of all, and there's all the contact details are there.
Thanks very much. I believe you'll find on the agenda page a link to further reading, and we have the link to the Brain Bank there, and we can also pop it in the chat for you shortly. So our next question, for those of us who have this progressive condition now and who might find existing medications difficult to take because of the side effects, can you give us hope and say that there will be new medications, devices, or procedures before long, which we will be able to benefit from? So perhaps, I don't know, Alastair, if you'd like to go first, anything you're looking out for that you feel particularly hopeful about in the next short while?
Yeah, so I think there are reasons to be hopeful. I mean, fortunately, I get to hear about quite a lot of drugs and non-drugs, so devices that might be in kind of research stages right now and exploring how effective they are, but may come to the market in the next few years. So I think there's lots of reasons to be optimistic right now. We have good drugs for Parkinson's disease. I think it's possible that not everyone gets on with some of the medication, but there's often a drug for you that you will find some benefit from. And for the vast majority of patients with Parkinson's disease, actually the drugs are effective and well tolerated. But there are more coming, and there are some exciting ones coming, and particularly some of the devices that need to be tested in the next few years and then potentially come to market that may treat some of the symptoms that the medication doesn't manage so well. Those are also very exciting.
Thanks very much. And Laurel, is there anything you've heard or read about that you're feeling particularly hopeful about?
Well, at the weekend, I heard a talk by Dr. Kevin McFarthing about his hope list, which he keeps, which I believe is going to be talked about later in the conference. That gives you a really good picture about what is being investigated and the things that are likely to happen in the near future. And it is very encouraging. I think in terms of devices, there are several coming along. I know that they have to be proven. But one in test phase is the Q1, which is produced by one of our sponsors, Charco. And I know that good things have been said by some of the people testing it. So it's a question, as a person with Parkinson's, of crossing our fingers that these things actually do, prove to be efficacious for a large number of people. But I just say, as a person with Parkinson's, that we sometimes find therapies that suit some of us but not others. But that's still very encouraging, because hopefully somewhere out there there'll be something that will help you as an individual.
Can I just chip in and say that in all of this, it's crucial that we have volunteers that are willing to try the new drugs and new devices. So we're also looking to you to help us get those things into the clinical space.
Thank you. I have a question here from Nick. Can exercise limit or slow the progression of Parkinson's? Might be another one for Alastair.
I believe so. I mean, I usually say to people that I see in my clinic that the way that they self-manage, and exercise is a big part of self-management, is as crucial as what we can do from a medication perspective. So taking ownership of the diagnosis and managing your Parkinson's effectively is absolutely crucial. And exercise is a big part of that. So in research studies, we see that people who have exercised a lot are at reduced risk of Parkinson's disease. So that suggests to us that it may be disease modifying. Of course, it's very difficult to study because people in the very early stages of Parkinson's in those studies may be exercising less. There have been some clinical trials using exercise programs, and those also show benefits of exercise, but whether that just improves your general health and fitness or really is disease modifying is hard to say. The bottom line is exercise definitely helps at an individual level.
Thanks very much. And Steve, a question perhaps you could help us with. Do you see the same pathology in the vagus nerve as in the brain in Parkinson's? Is that something you look at the Brain Bank lab?
So we won't look at the vagus nerve itself, but where we look is where the nerve cells of the vagus nerve are actually in the brainstem. And that is an area, bottom of the brainstem, where we see the earliest changes in the brain. So you may be aware that there is some suggestion that perhaps there's something in the environment that may trigger the disease process. And if that is true, there are two obvious routes into the brain. One's up your nose. There's not very much between the top of your nose and the brain. And we do find pathology in the smell organs, the olfactory bulbs. And the other is, do we ingest something? Do we take it into the gut? And does it follow its way up the vagus nerve to the brainstem? And that's quite compelling that the first changes are found in that vagus motor nucleus. So there's a lot of interest in this. And moving away perhaps from even understanding the disease process, there's the idea that maybe if we look in the gut, we might be able to find a biomarker for the early stages of disease before anyone's got any symptoms. So there's plenty of interest in that, what we call the gut-brain axis.
Thank you. And Laurel, I think you might be able to help us with this question. Can a person without a diagnosis of Parkinson's take part in research? And if they have parents or grandparents or a family linked to Parkinson's, is this beneficial to research at all?
I believe everyone can take part in research because as well as people with Parkinson's, we need controls. My husband has taken part in a lot of studies in tandem with me, and actually it helps perhaps to have a family member or a friend or a partner doing it with you because they understand the process more, and you get two for the price of one. So definitely I would urge anyone who is a friend or sort of connected with people with Parkinson's to get involved if they can. We'll all drive things forward.
Thank you, Laurel. And Alastair, I believe the Predict PD study, which you are lead researcher on, looks specifically for people that don't have Parkinson's.
That's right. So yeah, shameless plug, and thanks for the opportunity. So yeah, we're really interested in what happens to people before they get a diagnosis of Parkinson's disease. So these may be people that have been exposed to environmental risk factors, or they may have early subtle signs that perhaps indicate Parkinson's, but they don't yet fulfill criteria. We are looking for people aged 60 to 80 to take part in the Predict PD study. It's online at predictpd.com. We're looking for 10,000 people. This is a study that's been funded by Parkinson's UK really for the last 10 years. And we're just in the kind of final phase of recruitment, and then we'll be following people up and working hard to improve our risk calculator to work out how we can find people in the earliest stages and then try to take those people to clinical trials to try and prevent or delay the onset of Parkinson's. Thank you.
Thank you. And Steve, I believe you can also donate your brain to the Brain Bank.
I was going to come in with another shameless plug. Actually, in terms of understanding the pathology in the brain, we need what we call controls or normal brains, people that don't have the disorder for comparison. It's a moot point as to what a normal person is, but someone without Parkinson's, I think, is probably a better description.
That's great. Thank you all. And a very popular question here from Simon. Is there any commonality in the rate of progression of Parkinson's, or does that depend really on the individual?
I guess for me, maybe. Well, what's clear is that people do progress at different rates, and that goes back to our kind of earlier thoughts about how Parkinson's is probably an umbrella, and there are different conditions beneath that umbrella, and so some people progress at a faster rate than others, and some progress at a very slow and indolent rate, and some of the one of the things that interests me is the potential role that type 2 diabetes plays in that. So I believe that if you have type 2 diabetes that's poorly controlled, it may drive a more severe phenotype or a more severe progression course. And one of our research projects is looking at that. We talked about the importance of self-management. So it's very clear that if people take control of their diagnosis and exercise and keep cognitively fit and mentally stimulated and socially interacting with people, that they have a better prognosis. So there are different rates of progression. There are probably different determinants, and what we need to do right now is understand what those different determinants are and whether they're at all modifiable, whether we can change them to switch people to a slower course.
Thanks very much, Alastair. And Laurel, we have a question for you. Are there any certain aspects to a research study that would make you less likely to take part? For example, the duration of the research, certain activities involved, and so on?
One or two. I found it very much easier to take part now that a lot can be done remotely, because one thing that can put you off is having to travel long distances to actually go to clinic. And I found it a relief since COVID. It's a funny thing to say, but a lot of things can be done remotely. Because as a person with Parkinson's, you often tend to get nervous just being in an unusual situation and having to do things outside your comfort zone. So having part of the research being able to be done kind of in your own home is very encouraging from my point of view. I think the length of trial could turn you off, because particularly if you're taking some kind of drug that is unproven, it is potentially risky, because otherwise it wouldn't be research. And you have to be clear about why you're doing it, what the possible risks are, making sure that you know that you're being tested regularly, and you know what things could happen that would alert you to contact the team that are looking after you, just to make sure that they check that it's not something to do with what you're taking, and the length of time you're prepared to be on it, because sometimes that means you can't get involved in other things. That another trial could possibly come along, but you can't do that trial if you're already taking another substance. I was also offered a lumbar puncture once, and I declined that. It didn't appeal to me.
Thank you, Laurel. Steve, you might be able to help us with this one. Does the risk of Parkinson's continue to rise with every decade of life?
Superimposed on our individuality, yes, age is a risk factor for the onset of Parkinson's. But again, it's not predictable for the individual. But the older you are, the more likely, not just for Parkinson's, for things like Alzheimer's disease, age is a risk factor. Yeah. Not inevitable, but it does increase your risk.
Thank you. And a question from David, perhaps for Alastair. How common is Parkinson's dementia in people who are diagnosed with Parkinson's? Is it expected that the majority of Parkinson's patients will develop some kind of Parkinson's dementia, not Lewy body dementia or Alzheimer's, as in the later stages of their progression?
Well, I think it's a bit of a taboo subject, and it's one that we often try to avoid. I think, and we're not very good at talking about. But I think there's a bit of a shift to try and discuss this a bit more frankly. So in general, in studies that recruit large numbers of people with Parkinson's, then after about 5 years, perhaps up to 30% have some cognitive impairment, and up to about 8 years, it may be as many as half. And as people get much older and later in the disease, it may be higher numbers. That's not frank dementia, but it's cognitive impairment, such that some of the processes are not working as they once were. And I think, again, it's an area for research, but one of the things is trying to understand what the drivers of that are, and what of those are modifiable. There is also quite a lot of work being done right now to look at how to best treat that, because one of the complexities about people with Parkinson's who also have cognitive impairment is the drugs that help with some of the cognitive symptoms upset some of the movement symptoms, and vice versa. So the drugs that are particularly good for the movement can make cognition worse. So if people, from a kind of practical point of view, if people do have some cognitive impairment, probably the first thing to do is look at the medication that someone is taking to see if adjustments can be made. And actually, adjustments to medication can often mitigate and ameliorate those cognitive effects pretty effectively. But this is one of the reasons why I think that people should be followed up in a movement disorder service, or with, if they're older, with a care of elderly or geriatric service. I think that a team that is experienced in managing the full spectrum of what is Parkinson's disease is really important. And it's rare that nothing can be done. So actually engaging with the team and seeing them, there's lots that can be done to support as time goes on. It's not an inevitable consequence of Parkinson's. I want to make that clear, but it is something that happens.
Thanks very much, Alastair. And Steve, we have a question from John. He's not sure how long the brain bank has been running for, but have you had to change or increase the scope of the procedures that you undertake when analyzing slices of the brain? So have the procedures in the lab evolved over time?
Yes. So I can tell you the Parkinson's Brain Bank opened here at Imperial in 2003. So we're coming up now for 2 decades. And we've now seen just over 1,400 brains have been donated from the Parkinson's side of things, a few more from the control side of things as well. So an excellent rate of accrual, which is fantastic, because at the charity, we're not particularly interested in how many brains we collect. It's how much tissue we get out to research labs to get this disorder sorted out. And yes, things have evolved. As we've learned more about disease process, we can go and look for signs of pathology in the diagnostics. We've got new reagents, we've got specific antibodies that will pick up the pathology, make it very obvious. And with those new reagents, we're finding more in the brain. And this is why brain donation is so valuable. I say there are no 2 brains the same, but what we see, well, effectively, when I'm looking at the brain, I'm looking at a certain amount of a patient's life history, because everything that's happened is manifest in some way in changes in the brain. And anyone over the age of 65 has usually got perhaps a little bit more than just the Parkinson's pathology. There are other things there. And this is all, we're learning so much more because we have the tools to investigate. So, for example, genetics, we can now go back to the tissue. We can get much more genetic information than perhaps we could before. So yes, things are constantly evolving. The techniques are getting more sophisticated. And going back to the earlier question about, is there anything on the horizon? I think because of these types of donations, we're getting to understand the disease process much better. We know to some extent what's going wrong. The challenge now is stopping that. So there are various different ways of attacking that therapeutically. So the first question always is, well, what's the problem? I think we're now at the stage of how do we stop the problem? We know pretty much what's going on. Now it's a case of coming up with whether it be drugs or other types of intervention to stop the process. So I am optimistic, and that optimism is based on people's altruism. The donations of the brains are so important.
Thanks very much, Steve. And we have time for one last question. It's the most popular question on the Q&A and also a hot topic in the chat. And that question is there any possible benefits of using CBD, cannabidiol? Any clinical pointers to its efficacy? Any thoughts on CBD?
Well, I think that there's a clinical trial looking at derivatives, but I think more with a focus on pain than anything else. So, I would say that we need further research in this area. It's a bit of a cop-out to say it, but I think we need further research in this area before any clinical benefits can be backed up.
Thanks, Alastair. Laurel, anything you've read about CBD that you'd like to chime in from your perspective?
I think it's like with many things, some individuals have derived help from it, but I think it's too early to see it as a panacea for all of us. And I would say people should be cautious because of possible side effects, to be honest. I haven't tried it myself and I don't intend to.
Thank you. And Steve, any final comments or thoughts on that?
No, I think I agree with both Laurel and Alastair that it's too early to know about this. We need a lot more data to know if it really has any clinical efficacy. Again, there may be individual responses, but that doesn't really tell you if it's for a wider audience, so to speak.
Thank you. I'd like to thank you all very much for taking the time to speak today and for answering all of the questions. And to our audience, really brilliant variety of questions coming through. Please do keep them coming over the course of the day. And we're moving into a break now, but I will look forward to seeing you again for our second session. Thank you again, Laurel, Alastair, and Steve.
Thank you.
Thank you.